Welcome to Behind the Investigation with Atlanta News First Investigates. I'm Sierra Cummings. I've got Andy Parati here with a really fascinating story. How you doing, Andy?
Good. How are you?
I am so great. I'm really intrigued by this story because, I think we do hear that broader narrative about the school to prison pipeline, but your story kind of focuses on those nitty gritty details. This is another installment in your Reading Reset series. Talk to me about how you came across this particular perspective.
Yeah, I got this idea after speaking to the executive director of a literacy organization that really told me about this DOJ report, the Department of Justice report about 30 years ago that was published that really talked about the cause of delinquent behavior and incarceration and directly linking poor literacy, low reading proficiency. And there's a moment in this story where you sort of like pause and you have a oh my goodness moment where you see the decades that Georgia's literacy rates have not reached that proficiency level, and then the statistic of where Georgia stands in incarceration rates. You're gonna, when you watch and listen to the story, you're gonna have that moment too.
I've never visited. I think it's gonna be really interesting. It's a little nerve-wracking.
Kayla Hill is headed somewhere she doesn't want to go.
I might cry, honestly, because life's a lot different today.
On her way to the Barrow County Detention Center in Northeast Georgia, where she served time behind bars in and out of custody, 6 years for drug-related offenses, but this time as a free woman and sober. When you walk through the doors of this jail, what were you thinking?
A lot. Really sad for the girl who came here. And honestly, just really, really proud.
Kayla says what saved her was a program to help get her GED while incarcerated. Before, the 33-year-old says she struggled to read basic words.
I remember being in Miss Harden's class at Belmont Elementary. And I think that's where I realized that I had an issue with reading. And they were going around the room, and I had no idea, like, where people were when they were reading, how they knew what they were saying.
A report published by the U.S. Department of Justice 30 years ago echoes Kayla's struggle in the classroom, shedding light on the link between poor reading proficiency and incarceration, revealing that reading failure is most likely a cause, not just a correlate for delinquent behavior, adding on average, incarcerated juvenile offenders are severely crippled readers. Judd Smith is the Barrow County Sheriff.
It's plug and play. It is 100% a link that if you do not have literacy and you don't have an education, you are walking down a path of recidivism, criminal activity, and then at that point, you're taken from society.
Testing results released by the National Assessment of Education Progress released this year underscores the severity of the problem. The line on this graph identifies what's considered a proficient reader in fourth grade. Since 1998, Georgia's fourth grade reading scores have never reached that proficiency goal. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, Georgia locks up 968 per 100,000 people. That's not only the highest in the U.S., the state incarcerates more people than any free democratic country on earth. Would you say, other than mental health, that low literacy is maybe the second most contributing factor of whether you're going to be in a jail or not in your lifetime?
I think that's very safe to say, and I think that all the data shows that.
So why are literacy rates so poor in Georgia? The DOJ report places blame on colleges and universities for not adequately preparing future teachers, concluding that most teachers have little or no knowledge of phonetics or intensive systematic phonics programs. In other words, not enough focus on instruction that includes sounding out words. The tragic side effect, the report wrote, is that reading teachers inadvertently victimize their students with less effective, if not ineffective, reading instruction.
It hurts my heart. The word victimized seems like such a strong word, but it's true. It's true.
Shannon Hammond is Executive Director of Adult Literacy Bureau. She spent decades as a Georgia elementary school teacher and administrator.
We are crippling our young learners by not teaching them how to read.
Shannon says teachers are not to blame. She says they were only teaching how they were told to teach by universities. Before she left the public school system last year, she helped retrain teachers explicitly using phonics in their curriculum.
I would have tears from teachers in the sessions, and they would just say, I feel so guilty. I think about all the students that I've taught that I did a disservice to. And I always use the Maya Angelou quote about we do the best we can until we know better, but once we know better, we have to do better.
30 years after the DOJ study, an education policy group says higher education is largely not doing better. The National Council on Teacher Quality, or NCTQ, published a report in 2023 concluding that too many teachers are not training in scientifically based reading instruction. It gave 191 college programs in 44 states a failing grade, including 7 institutions in Georgia, after identifying what it calls debunked reading methods in course material.
If I was paying to be in medical school and you were teaching me outdated medical treatments, that would not be okay. And I don't think medical schools could get away with that. So why do colleges of education get away with that?
The University System of Georgia has oversight of higher education in the state. It did not respond to requests for an interview, but wrote to Atlanta News First Investigates that it has strong concerns with NCTQ's findings, which studies have shown rely on flawed research methodology.
What we're just really doing is we want best practice for our kids.
State Representative Bethany Ballard, a former English teacher, and State Senator Billy Hickman do not dismiss the NCTQ's findings. They want state universities to prove they are training future reading teachers the right way.
My favorite quote for Ronald Reagan is, trust but verify. We need to be auditing whether they're really doing it.
I think it was scary having to learn how to believe in myself.
3 years after earning her GED, Kayla is more than a proficient reader. She's a teacher at Lanier Technical College, helping students learn to well, giving them new skills and a chance at a bright future, something she almost didn't see for herself.
It gave me something to tell my kids that I'd done for myself that I was proud of. It is probably the biggest moment in my life.
Andy, you talk about this moment in the story where it is just kind of palpable, like really sitting with the data. And before we kind of double down on it, hearing from the sheriff directly, like him answering your question, that you say, after mental health, do you think literacy is the next cause related to people entering the jail system? And him basically saying, yeah, absolutely. The data, the statistics all point to that. It's really powerful.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that he took the time to speak with us about this. You know, often people ask me, you know, how do I find my stories or how do I find my, you know, the people that I'm going to interview for the story? I actually have to give a shout out to Jack. Jack is the name that I give my chat GBT. and I said, hey, what sheriffs in the state of Georgia are advocating for literacy? And he came across as one of the recommendations because he posted, or the sheriff's department posted, a picture of him at a literacy fundraising event. And so I reached out to him. Turns out they had that GED program. And I said, hey, listen, this is what I'm looking at. I know that's kind of, you know, out of left field when it comes to, you know, an interview with the sheriff. But I'd love your thoughts. And he was so interesting to hear from someone in criminal justice say, yeah, this is what we see in our jail population. Mental health and people who can't read, and here are the consequences.
And when you think about reading, you're so right. The first person that your mind goes to is not the sheriff. What's really interesting here is that you tried to really hit. Oh, wait, I want to back up here. responsible use of Chat GPT. Like, we want to issue a disclaimer.
Right.
We do not use Chat
Right.
GPT to do our stories or our investigative reporting, but like, that's such a
Thanks for clearing
fascinating,
that
that's such a fascinating way to use it as a tool to help in the investigative process. So now I'm going to steal that from you.
Okay.
Jack, you said his name
That's
was?
that's what I call mine.
Jack. But you got so many perspectives in here, including that organization. And she said something really powerful in your interview with her. And she's like, well, I'm going to steal from Maya Angelou. Once you know better, you do better.
Right. I was so grateful that Shannon Hammond, the executive director of Adult Literacy Bureau, chose to speak with us because I was not originally going to include her in the story. She is the person that introduced me to Kayla Hill, the main character that we used in the beginning and the end of the piece. But after speaking with her, and I realized that she was a former school teacher and a former school administrator for decades, she knew exactly what I was talking about. When I mentioned this 30-year report, she said, Andy, we've been trying to get teachers taught the right way to teach children how to read forever. In fact,
Wow.
when I just left the school system and we were, to me, one of the most powerful moments, there's so many powerful moments in
Yeah.
the story, but when she told me she would leave training sessions where there were teachers in tears going, oh my God, what have I done? I've incorrectly taught children the wrong way to learn how to read. What are the implications to that? And then of her sort of saying, listen, it's not your fault. You were only doing what you were told. I thought that was so compelling. And so I asked her, I said, can you please, take part in an interview, be part of this story? And actually just got a text from her just a moment ago because we're doing this behind the investigation the day we're publishing the story. And she was
Wow.
like, thank you so much. I would love to share this. And I was like, please do.
And it was so meaningful for her to make sure that the audience doesn't have that negative takeaway. Her just explicitly saying, we can't blame the teachers. They're only teaching based on the way they were taught. And you really see how this issue is cyclical. Like it
Yeah.
really is just this problem that runs in a cycle, and it's not the fault of the teachers.
Yeah,
This
and she-
burden is not all theirs.
Right. She wanted to make it very clear that she is a huge public school advocate, that she didn't want this to, have a bad light on public schools. She is a huge advocate of it. What she was not an advocate of, though, was the universities and colleges that she believes are not adequately preparing future teachers. So she wanted to make sure, and I'm so grateful that she did that, and I hope that came across in the story.
Yeah, it absolutely did. And let's just kind of spend some time here with your main character, Kayla. How'd you find out about her?
So, I'll pull back the curtain. It's so interesting. It started with Jack, right? Jack, my ChatGPT friend. He found this sheriff, Facebook post. I reached out to the sheriff. The sheriff recommended Shannon Hammond, the executive director of that adult literacy organization. And I said, hey, Shannon, you know anyone that's gone through your program that was detained and incarcerated? She recommended Kayla Hill. Kayla Hill couldn't have been more kind and generous with her time. I mean, she's being very vulnerable, but telling us one of the most worst moments in her life, in and out of incarceration for years. And in addition to that, saying that I had really low reading proficiency.
Yeah.
So that's how it came about. And the day that we interviewed her, God bless her, she was so kind, and we essentially moved her in 3 different locations within just the span of hours. We interviewed
Wow.
her in the classroom,
Yep.
we interviewed her in the car, and then I said, oh, and by the way, we're going to go to jail.
Go to jail.
And-
I know. Starting with that, I was like, oh, we got her back
Right.
at the jail.
Yeah.
That you don't even think about maybe the emotional toll that could take
I
on
was
someone
not
going
expecting
back.
that.
Yeah.
I was not expecting, because it had been a few years, but
Yeah.
those were all raw emotions that we were not expecting from someone that I just met.
Certainly a success story. This is kind of separate from the legislative session, but I do want to kind of go back to
Yeah.
what's happening under the Gold Dome, because at the time of us filming this, what are we, a day out from the last day of the legislative
Yeah.
session? And you have seen some kind of movement related to how teachers should be teaching in this entire process. So talk about where that bill stands.
Yeah, so much has happened this week, including breaking news today that I'll tell you in about a second. But a few days ago, Georgia lawmakers passed the bill that would ban a controversial teaching method called 3Qing. Won't get into too many details, but essentially some experts believe that it's asking children to guess how to say words instead of using phonetics and sounding out words. And it would also remove a controversial reading intervention program that the state has used for decades called reading recovery, which is targeted to first graders that have some of the worst readers in the classroom. And then just today, I found out that State Senator Rashawn Kemp, his legislation just passed. It's a companion bill. What his does, though, it's going to start that auditing process. It's going to essentially look to make sure that universities are doing their job. So that I just found that out right before we were starting to record this behind the investigation. So lots of happening in the state, and it's all to address Georgia's literary crisis, where right now, a report issued just this year shows that 70% of Georgia fourth graders cannot read proficiently. So the state is taking a lot of action. I think it's going to take a couple of years until we find out whether that action is going to result in anything that shows that it's working.
Getting action, certainly a job well done. Fascinating reporting. We know you will stay on top of it. I look forward to that last day of the legislative session, sine die. It's been a long legislative session. Thanks for joining us, Andy. Tell people how they can get in contact with you.
Oh, gosh.
Everywhere.
Google my name, and you can find me on all the socials.
Use
my
Jack.
email
Use
address.
Jack.
And AtlantaNewsFirst.com.
All right. You've been watching and listening to Behind the Investigation with Atlanta News First Investigates. Be sure to download and listen wherever you get your podcasts.